Well, good afternoon, everyone. It is 12 o'clock. We will go ahead and get the meeting started today. That way we don't take up too much of your Friday afternoon. But I would like to thank everyone for joining us today. With us as presenters today, we have Rod Reeves and Kyle Paulson from the Tarrant County Appraisals District. They have been gracious enough to kind of walk us through what is needed as far as for your ag and wildlife valuation from their standpoint. Then wrapping up the meeting today will be Dr. Blake Bennett with AgriLife Extension, talking about ag and homestead property taxes. We do ask that you keep your videos off as well as muted. It just helps with bandwidth. If you've got questions, please put them in the chat. I will relay them to the presenters for you. Also, if you are a real estate agent needing hours, please be sure that we have your real estate license number. That way we can get that turned in for you. And also please be mindful of the fact that you will only get that accreditation hour if you are live on this call. This meeting will also be recorded for future reference, but again, that hour will only count on the live presentations today. With that being said, I will turn it over to Rod and Kyle, and we will start our meetings. It's all yours, guys.
All right, we're in. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about 1D1, which is what a lot of people call an ag exemption. We'll learn today that it's not really an exemption as much as it is a special appraisal of a property. With that being said, I might goop up and call it an ag exemption myself, but just know that it is a special appraisal on a property and it's not an exemption. All right, so there's two types of agricultural appraisals in Texas. There is what we call 1D, and there's 1D1. Now, everybody in Tarrant County that qualifies or has ag is a 1D1 property. 1D is very, very rare, and well, I'll get into basically the difference here in a slide or two, but just know everything we're going to talk about today is going to be a 1D1 agricultural property. So, but I'll get into those differences here in a minute. Like I said earlier, a 1D1 is a special appraisal and not an exemption. With that said, agricultural properties are going to have two values that basically run concurrent. There's going to be the market value, which we all know is what the property would sell for on the open market in a cash transaction. And then there's going to be the use value. Basically, it's agricultural value on the property. For tax purposes, you get taxed on the use value, which is good news because it's generally about $100 an acre, plus or minus, depending on your activity. So it's a pretty big tax break, which is we'll talk about that as well. With that being said, you only get that benefit on the land itself, and not any of the structures that are attached to the land, i.e. a shed, barns, houses. Any improvements on top of the land itself is taxed at the standard. So the key differences in 1D and 1D1. One of the major differences in slide 1 here, you can see that for 1D, you have to reapply every year. A 1D1 is a one-time application. Now, the only time you have to send in an additional application is if we notice that maybe it's fallen below the degree of intensity, or we just need an updated application. But we will ask for one, where a 1D is required to fill one out every year. The other major difference is the history requirements. It's only 3-year history on 1D, or it's a 5-year history on 1D1. And then for rollback purposes, whenever the property is sold as a 1D, it's rolled back, or a 1D1, it's actually the change of use of the land. And then really the reason that most people don't qualify for the income aspect, basically the primary income has to come from agricultural enterprise, and there's just not enough or big enough farms here in Tarrant County to the primary income. So that's why everyone, for the purposes of the fact you only have to apply once.
Hey, Kyle, we're having a hard time hearing you. If you could move closer to your microphone, that would be great.
Oh, yeah. Let me see if I can turn up my volume. Is this better right here?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. All right. So with that said, we're really only going to talk about 1D1, just because that's what everyone in Tarrant County generally qualifies for. So qualifications of land under section 1D1. Generally, land may qualify for agricultural use if it's currently devoted principally to the agricultural use to the degree of intensity that's generally accepted in the area. To qualify for special appraisal, the property owner must apply for the appraisal, provide the chief appraiser with information necessary for the appraisal district to determine the validity of the claim. So basically what's that saying is the land's primary use has to be an agricultural use. It's got to be to the degree of intensity that's generally accepted in the area. They have to apply for it, and they have to provide us with information to help verify the use on the property. For land to qualify for 1D1, the agricultural use, it must meet 4 steps or requirements, and those 4 steps are going to be here. Again, step 1, it applies only to the land, not improvements on the land. Then step 2, we have to determine if the land is currently and principally devoted to agricultural use. If it passes step 1 and 2, we then go to the degree of intensity test. Once it passes the degree of intensity test, we have to then look at the history aspect of the land. They have to pass the time test, which is generally a 5-year history of agricultural use before it would qualify for the special appraisal on the property. All right, so looking at step 1, again, that's pretty self-explanatory. Like I said, the value only applies to the land itself. It doesn't apply to any houses, barns, sheds, things of that nature. If it's a residence on an ag land, we'll have to basically split it off to where it's on its own account and things like that. But again, it only applies to the land itself. Now we have to look at how the property is currently used and if its principal use is an agricultural use. Things that we would look for in the field or agricultural activities would be, cultivating the soil for crops, human food, animal food, floriculture, viticulture, horticulture. Most commonly is grazing land, raising livestock, wildlife management, which Rob will get into later. There's keeping of exotic animals and also beekeeping, which beekeeping is the land must be not less than 5 acres and not more than 20. And we'll get into beekeeping a little more in depth because it is kind of the newest, hottest ag use, I guess, in Tarrant County. We're seeing a lot more of that year after year. One of the reasons why I think is probably just the size requirements. It's a little smaller, 5 acres than normally your grazing land or your crop land is generally between 8 to 10 acres of land. So it's a little bit less land. So a lot of people, more properties would qualify for it. This is an example of native pasture that we'd come out and see. Your grazing land. So for grazing properties, domesticated animals that derive its primary nutrients from vegetation. supplemented as necessary with commercial feed. Generally, will allow for supplemental feeding in the wintering months where the grasses are dormant. Mostly we see cattle, horses, some goats. I can't think of a swine or poultry or sheep operation off the top of my head. I'm sure there's some sheep around, but mainly you're going to look for cattle, horses, and goats. Cropland, pretty self-explanatory. The major crops that we see are going to be wheat. What else? We got sorghum. We got a little bit of corn, and that's about as oats. You see some oats. So, but here's a picture of just a wheat field. Cultivating the soil, producing crops for human food, animal food. Beekeeping, pretty self-explanatory, raising or keeping of bees. For human food or commercial products, again, the land must be between 5 and 20 acres, and it must be a minimum of 6 beehives. And improved pasture land, generally your coastal Bermuda. Now that can either be grazed out or baled and used for supplemental feeding at a different time, or sold as is. Orchards, there's some pecan orchards in Tarrant County. There's somebody that tried an apple orchard once, but I think the weather got to it. So, but you very rarely see just a ton of orchards in this area, and it's probably having to do with the amount of rain and things of nature we get over here. But orchards are one, and it's usually pecan orchard, and there's a few down in that Burleson area. So then once you pass step 1 and 2, you then go to the degree of intensity test. To qualify for productivity value for agricultural use, the land must be currently devoted to an agricultural use to the degree of intensity that is generally accepted in the area. So the degree of intensity test is examined in the year the property owner applies for their ag appraisal and every year after. It does not count. We do not use the degree of intensity test for the 5-year history, the preceding years. The degree of intensity test measures whether land is being farmed or ranched for agricultural purposes. To receive a productivity appraisal for agricultural use, the land must be used for an agricultural purpose to the degree of intensity that's typical to the area. This test is intended to exclude land on which token agricultural use is given in order to obtain tax relief. So basically, we don't want to see the 20-acre tract with one horse out there. The only reason they're doing that would just be for tax relief. We're trying to separate people that are going for tax relief to an actual agricultural enterprise. The chief appraiser must set standards according to the agricultural practices in effect in the relevant area. And because of the varying of soil types, climate conditions, crops in the state as large as Texas, no single statutory definition could possibly cover all possible issues. So what that means is the chief appraiser for each county in Texas is responsible for setting his standards. And the reason that is it basically, the carrying capacity of cattle in East Texas is going to vary tremendously from the carrying capacity in West Texas. So what we do in Tarrant County and all other counties, we meet with local farmers and kind of see what would be typical to the area. What's your carrying capacity? What do you do here? What do you do there? And we set our standards in Tarrant County. And I'll get into those standards later, but just know that they differ from county to county. So what's acceptable in Tarrant County might not be acceptable in Wise County, Parker County. Therefore, if you want their standards, you'd have to call their appraisal district that lies inside that county and kind of get their exact standards. But just know they do vary from county to county. And then the last thing we look at is the time period test. And this is pretty self-explanatory. Basically, if it's outside the city limits, the property has to have an agricultural use for 5 out of 7 years. If it's inside the city limits, it's got to have a continuous 5-year agricultural history in order to qualify. So if you buy a piece of raw land that's never had an agricultural use on it and you're in the city, you got to farm it and ranch it for 5 years before you would qualify for the special appraisal on the property. And like I said earlier, the history aspect for the 5 years, we don't look at the degree of intensity. We just look at does it have an agricultural use for them?
Kyle, before you go any further, we've got one quick question in the chat.
Okay.
And the question is, what about exotic game? Example, axis deer, can that be used as exempt?
Yeah, it can. It is in the tax code. We don't actually have any I can think off the top of my head in Tarrant County, but it is an acceptable use.
Thank you. That's the only question we have at this time.
Okay, great. Yep. In fact, I could go back to that slide here in a little bit where it talks about that. Right here is our minimum requirements. This is kind of a quick little chart you can refer to. It is located on our website. It basically covers the three most things we see in Tarrant County. So you're either ranching, you're farming, or you're a beekeeper. And obviously there's many other things you could do, but this covers 99% of ag appraisals in Tarrant County. So let's say you want to be a rancher. So how do I qualify? Do you have a minimum of 5 animal units? If it's no, you're already below our standard, then it would not qualify. If it's yes, go to the next. If it's good grasses, you can get away with 8 acres. And then you go to the next, the history aspect of it. And the next, go ahead and file your application. So it's just a handy chart to kind of look through to see, basically, do I or do I not qualify for these particular agricultural use? So the application process, in order to get the ag appraisal on their property, they do have to file a application, which sounds like a no-brainer, but you would be surprised at the amount of properties that you buy an ag property and you don't apply for your ag appraisal, and the next year it's removed and you're wondering why. Well, you have to apply for it. Generally, we send out letters to each new owner, just kind of encouraging them, for a better word, to apply, just so we don't run into this situation. But it does happen, and it happens probably once or twice every year, where it's either they forget about it or they don't think they have to, but they just fail to apply, and now they have to pay market value taxes on 100 acres, which is a pretty big hit. So we do require an application. The tax code requires you to fill one out. A lot of times people will own several tracts of land side by side. You just have to fill out one application, and you can reference all the properties that are used in conjunction with that one property. So one application can cover many parcels of land. The deadline is actually coming up. It's April 30th. So we're quickly approaching the deadline for filing a timely ag application. We will accept late applications. There is a penalty associated with that, but we will only accept applications up until the certification date of the tax roll, which is generally around July 20th. So once the tax roll is certified and somebody decides that they now want to apply for ag, we can no longer accept that application. We just mail it back to them and just let them know it's not timely. and that they then have to file one next year. It's just too late for this year. So it is a simple application. It really does not take that long to do. And I'll show you, I think I got a copy of one in here. I'll kind of walk you through it real quick, but again, kind of know those dates. You got a couple days to apply for ag for a timely application, and then you got a couple months before we can no longer accept them. Now, this is our application right here. I believe it's 5 or 6 pages long. Couple simple questions, what tax year? It's going to be 2022. It's a couple real, did they own the property on this date type thing. Section 1 is going to be for individual homeowners. They would fill that out. If you have a tax agent representing you, they would fill out Section 2. Section 3, it's just going to be the description of the property. What's the account number? How many acres are we talking? What's the lot block? Things of that nature. This is where if you have multiple accounts, you can kind of put them all in the box there. And then on the number of acres, you would reference the total number of acres that you're applying for. Section 4 basically was ag on the property last year. Is it in the city? Things of that nature. Section 5 is going to be a pretty important one. It's going to be the use on the property. So this is where you'd put the current use. So let's say it's a hay field. You'd put hay operation, and you're applying on whatever the amount of acres is, 20 acres. And then you'll see there's 1 through 7 over there. So that's going to be, how is it used over the past 7 years? And this is going to help us with the history aspect of it, like we talked about earlier, where it's got to have a 5-year history. So you would put, how it's been used, and that would help us determine whether or not it's going to qualify for the special appraisal. Question 2, what is it, livestock? You put cattle down and the number of acres. You would put cattle down and the number of head, or if you're growing crops, you would put what type of crops and how many acres. So like I said, it's a pretty self-explanatory application. Section 6 is for wildlife use. So if you are applying for wildlife, you would then fill this section out. And it's going to be another page after this, but it's going to ask you some yes or no questions. And then along with that, you would then turn in a wildlife management form. There we go. Without saying it. And then Section 7 is going to be timber production. Tarrant County is not a timber producing county, so you just leave that. And then the last page, name, sign, and date. And I talked about this already, the failure to file an application. You don't file for the ag on the property, you're going to pay market value on the property. And like I said, it's unfortunate, but it does happen a couple times every year. All right, well, I'm going to hand over to Rod. He's going to get into what happens when you decide to change the use on the property, meaning going from a qualified agricultural use to basically stopping your ag use and incurring a rollback penalty. And then he'll get into wildlife a little bit. Here's Rod.
Hi, everyone. My name's Rod Reeves. Kyle and I kind of divide the county in half. I normally cover the southern portion of the county. But like Kyle said, I'm going to touch on change of use and wildlife. When people also, with the change of use, you can also hear the term rollback, and we use that term interchangeably up here at the office as well. But the picture here, you can see development happening, and that's typically what we think of when we think of a rollback or a change in use. This used to be a property that had 1D1 ag on it, And obviously they've stopped the agriculture operations. So something like this is what we would see when we go out in the field, and this would trigger the rollback. Okay, so the rollback procedure for the 1D1. The first point there is telling us not only can a rollback occur when you're actually out there developing it, like we saw in that last picture, but any stoppage, permanent stoppage in the agricultural operation can trigger the rollback. And I'm not talking about like moving the cattle off to another property, like a rotational grazing or anything like that. I'm talking about a complete stoppage of use, such as, if Kyle and I were out in the field, we might see if you're running cattle out on the property, and we drive by and we see all the fences are torn down, then, obviously that's an issue, and that's going to be a red flag for us. But a rollback is when the property is under 1D1 and that agricultural use stops, and we recapture taxes for the 3 previous years. And the way that works is you would take the amount of money or taxes that would have been collected off of the market value for those 3 previous years and subtract what was paid under the ag value, which typically is not a whole lot. And so those 3 years would be recaptured. And that law, that has recently changed. In the past, it was a 5-year rollback, and it also had interest on each of those years. But recently, like I said, the law has changed. The rollback now is only 3 years. An important bullet point there down at the bottom here is the tax code actually, and it actually is on the application that Kyle presented a minute ago on the very first page. The landowner is required to notify us of any change of use. And there's actually a penalty that could be associated with it. We don't see a whole lot of this. We would love to see more people actually notify us. It actually benefits the owner and us if they will notify us first. And I'll explain that here in just a second. Okay, what qualifies as a change of use? Like I said, it could be the development of the property. It's a stoppage or a physical change in the property itself, which could be a stoppage in use. I think a common misconception is that the sale of the property or the replatting of a property triggers a rollback, and that is not the case. It's the actual physical change on the property itself. It's something that we would see when we go out to the property, whether it's the development or a complete stop of the agricultural process. I was going to touch a little bit on the rollback process, on how we move forward on it. So the first part would be, Kyle and I would discover the rollback. And the way we do that is we drive accounts each year. We try to drive half the ag accounts each year, and we do our best. We also drive permits each year. We drive ownership changes. So we try to stay on top of, the changes that are occurring out there. Another way is the owner notifies us. Like I mentioned a minute ago, the tax code requires it. It benefits both us and the taxpayer. If we go out to the property and we see tractors out on the property, we do our best to gauge on how much is being torn up or developed, on exactly what's going on out there. But in some cases, we'll get a phone call from the landowner saying, hey, we're only going to develop a part of that track, and you guys roll back the whole track. Well, sometimes we can't tell when we go out there. So that's why it's important for the landowner to notify us, because it takes part of that guessing out of it. We know exactly what the plan is and what's going on. So it's real important that people do notify us on that. But after we go out and we discover or we see something happening in the field and we think there's a change of use occurring, we come to the office and we send what's called a determination letter, and it's a certified letter. It goes out to the taxpayer. It notifies them that we think a change of use has occurred. We notify them on how many acres we think the change of use is taking place on. From that point forward, the landowner has 30 days to protest the change of use. If they disagree that, no, there's not a change of use taking place, or if they disagree with the amount of acreage that we have issued the rollback on, they can protest at that point. And they have 30 days from the date that letter is sent out. They do protest it. What we can do is Kyle and I can work informally and try to come to an agreement, once they notify us and tell us what's going on. If it's different from what we think we saw when we went out there, we can work informally and try to resolve that issue after they file that protest. If it's something we can't, come to an agreement on, then basically what happens is they take that protest to the appraisal review board, kind of just like when you protest your market value. You can also protest ag denial and change of use. So at that point, we would go before the review board and they would determine if a change of use has occurred and how much.
Rod, there is a question in the chat and it's concerning the rollback.
Okay.
Why do you capture a rollback if it was used for ag the prior year? And is this always done?
Yes, this is the way the rollback works. And this is also, Kyle touched on the point that it's a special appraisal. It's not an exemption. And this is kind of why, because you're not totally exempt from those back taxes. There's that three-year recapture period. So if you had an ag property and you started to develop it in the year 2022, that would be the year of the rollback, or the year the change of use occurred. The rollback year would be 2021, 2020, and 2019. So it would recapture the taxes for those 3 years. The amount that would be paid for market value taxes in those years minus what was paid for the ag value. So that's the way the tax code, the tax law is written, and that's how we apply it each time. Now, there are some circumstances where the rollback could be a 2-year rollback or a 1-year rollback. And the way that works is, say in 2021, you called and asked us to remove ag, but you weren't going to develop it at that point. Basically, what we would do is that year would be at market value. It would no longer be ag. But if we issued the rollback, like I said, in 2022, under those circumstances, 2021 without ag would not be a rollback, but 2020, 2019 would be. So in that case, it would be a 2-year rollback. Hopefully that's not too confusing, but the maximum would be a 3-year rollback. Hope that answers it.
Thank you. No other questions at this time.
Okay, and so basically, if there's no protest after we send out that determination letter, after 30 days, we are going to notify the tax office at that point. We're going to notify a use change has taken place. We're going to notify them how many acres are in that use change and what account numbers to associate that use change with. The tax office at that point will calculate the rollback bill. At the appraisal district here, we do not calculate any type of tax bills. So it would all come from the tax office at that point. Another thing I'd throw out there is we have a lot of people that will call and ask for a rollback estimate. If they were going to develop it, how much how much would the rollback be? And we refer them, like I said, at that point to the tax office because we simply don't calculate the bills here. I think that's pretty much it on the use change. I'm going to move on to wildlife. We're getting more and more people transitioning to wildlife each year. So the main point this slide is making, and one of the big points you need to know, is you can't just apply directly to wildlife management. Your property has to be under 1D1 agricultural appraisal. Then you can transition or transfer or apply to transition or transfer to wildlife management. So basically, if you're approved on for cattle grazing a couple of years ago, and you decide you don't want to graze cattle on anymore, you want to transition to wildlife, then you would be eligible to do that at that point because your property is considered 1D1.
Hey, Rod, one other question before we kind of continue with wildlife.
Okay.
Okay. How is land that cannot be used for any purpose taxed? Example, is the land is under a gas well, storage tanks, gas compressor, and the paved road and needed for water and mud trucks to access their tanks. On our place, this is a large area. I cannot graze cattle on this area or build any structures.
So that kind of sounds like a market value question to me on how that portion of it would be valued. Ag-wise, we do have some people that have some like old gas wells where they use that for storing hay or something like that. And we'll take that in consideration. We kind of take it a case-by-case consideration for the ag part of it. But it kind of sounded like that question was market value related to me. If that, I'm not trying to sidestep the question, but if that helps, I hope that helps. So I'm gonna move on to this slide, how to convert your qualified space land over to a wildlife management operation. So the first thing, we're assuming that it's already under 1D1 ag. You'll need to come up with a wildlife management plan, and this can be done by contacting the Texas Parks and Wildlife or having a biologist come out and help you. Basically, you're going to figure out what type of species you're going to target. We have people that target a deer, turkey, or songbirds, just different things, and that's kind of going to determine how your plan is set forth on how you're going to move forward with your wildlife management plan. After you do that, you will need to fill out a 1D1 open space application that Kyle presented a little bit ago, and you'll need to fill out the wildlife portion on that application. Another form that you will need to fill out is a wildlife management plan. This form currently can be found on the Texas Parks and Wildlife. We're going to try to get this form added to our website. And the 1D1 open space application is on our website currently at www.tad.org. And if you click on forms, the 1D1 open space application is in there, and we hope to have the wildlife management plan in there soon as well. But on your first year when you're applying to transition to wildlife, you'll need to fill out both of these, the application and the wildlife management form. And to qualify for the wildlife, you're going to need to perform 3 out of the 7 qualifying wildlife tasks provided in that plan. And here are the qualifying tasks. You have habitat control, erosion control, predator control, census counts, providing supplemental water, supplemental food, or providing shelters. And I'll give you some examples of kind of the common things that we see on each one of these. A lot of what we see would be brush management, seeding, fertilizing, or deferred grazing. Those are common things we see under that. Erosion control could be pond construction or seeding to reestablish vegetation. And these are just a few examples. There's more, and it gets into it in the wildlife management plan as well. Under 3, predator control, the most common is probably fire ant control around here. Also trapping and shooting, like coyotes are, that's very popular. Census counts, different types of way of taking census counts, whether it's spotlighting or counts from stands, or, I can think of a few that target songbirds. The Audubon Society comes out to their property a few times a year and actually does the census count for them. But you don't have to do that, but that's one way they do it. Supplemental water could be through wells, trough, rain catchment type system. Supplemental food would be feeders or food plots, and the feeders could be deer feeders, it could be bird feeders. It just depends on what type of species you're targeting there. Providing shelters, the most common for sure would be nest boxes for the birds. We see those either attached to trees or on a stake, where they just drive the stake in the ground and have the nest box on that. And brush piles. So that's kind of a example of kind of the things that we see listed on the forms that are turned into us. These are the most common things. That if you are approved for wildlife management, it's not going to affect your taxes going from the 1D1 ag to the wildlife management. You're basically going to keep the same productivity or ag rate that you had before. So if we had you under native pasture, then that rate's going to stay the same once you convert over to wildlife management. Another thing after you're approved for the wildlife management is the wildlife form itself, the one that I mentioned that is currently on the Texas Parks and Wildlife website. That form is required annually. So you don't have to submit the application each year, but this form, the wildlife form, you do have to submit each year. And one of the things on the wildlife property is Kyle and I do go out to each wildlife property each year and just make sure it meets the requirements, the 3 out of the 7 qualifying tasks that I mentioned just a moment ago. And that pretty much wraps it up. This is our contact information. Both Kyle and I are generally in the office in the mornings each day. In the afternoons, it's normally a time that we're out looking at properties, but you can call us, email us at any time, and we'll be happy to try to answer any questions or reach out to you. But I think that's all we got, unless there's some other questions.
So, and at this time, we will go ahead and move on to Dr. Blake Bennett's presentation.
Okay, thank you very much. I am going to share my screen. Okay, can you see that, Jacqueline? Can you see my screen?
Yes, sir.
Perfect. All right, sounds good. I do appreciate the Central Appraisal District being on. I don't know if y'all are going to stick on for the second part of this, but if you do, then I might have you help me answer some of the questions that come up. We're going to talk about the residence homestead tax exemption and also how people pair it with agriculture and some of the things that I've learned. I've been doing a lot of work with real estate for the last 4 to 5 years. And I'm going to share some of the things that I've learned. Some of them I've just picked up on in the last few days. And they were added to this presentation just in the last few days. But again, talking about the residence homestead tax exemption and how it applies to agriculture. First of all, what is this residence homestead tax exemption? Well, looking at the property tax code, it's contained in section 11.13. And that section says that a residence homestead is a structure, and that can include a mobile home on land not exceeding 20 acres and the improvements used for the residential purposes. Now, I'm going to call into question, why would anybody want to have a residence homestead as big as 20 acres? Unless you just want a big yard and you've got time to mow it. But we'll get into that analysis here in just a little bit. But it can be up to 20 acres. And it's used in the residential occupying of the structure if the structure's on land and improvements of identical ownership. In other words, this is where you live. This is your home. You can declare your residence homestead where you live. Now, what exactly is the exemption that you get for this residence homestead? Well, right now, Texas law requires school districts to offer a minimum $25,000 exemption on that residence homestead. So in other words, if your appraised value is $1 million on your house, you take that $1 million and you subtract 25,000 from it. And so to calculate your school property taxes, the appraised value would actually be $975,000. For someone that owns a house that's $500,000 or $500,000, you would take that same $25,000 off. So their appraised value will be $475 for school tax purposes. So in this case, a dollar truly is worth more to a poor man than it is a rich man. The $25,000, you get to take that off regardless of whether or not your house is $2 or $5 or $10 million, or if it's $25,000, you get to take that amount off. Now, I will say, coming up on May the 7th, there's a vote that we're going to be able to take as Texans. We're getting to vote on whether or not that $25,000 exemption is actually raised to $40,000. So that exemption actually is on the table to be raised. A yes vote supports raising it to $40,000, and no vote opposes it. If that happens, then absolutely, you're going to see, statewide, that's going to be an economic hit to the amount of taxes that are going to be taken by, or that can be taken by these individual districts. So my suggestion here is everyone get out and vote. But I can tell you that if you raise the amount of the exemption, then tax districts, not the appraisal district, tax districts will likely raise the rates of those taxes. So, even though we get more of an exemption, then the rates will likely go up after this election if this passes. Another benefit from the residence homestead tax exemption, you get the $25,000 off, but once you have it in place, then the amount of the appraised value can only increase by 10% annually. So that is a huge benefit of having the residence homestead tax exemption in place. If you have it, particularly in years whenever, let's say that you've had that exemption on for the last 10 years. Well, these last 2 years, we've seen the market run away from. It's been a very, very hot market. And even though the market value is increasing very fast, your appraised value only increases by 10% annually. That's the law. If you don't have the residence homestead on your property, then the value can increase for tax purposes, can increase the full amount of the market. Now, there is a caveat here. Yes, there is a 10% cap. However, just this past week, I was asked a question and it led to what was added to this presentation for this week. The protection here of that 10% does not start until you've owned that property for over a full year. There's a limitation, section 23.23C of the Texas Property Tax Code. Basically, what it comes down, I've copied the tax code here, but essentially what it says is that whenever you buy property and you claim the residence homestead tax exemption, you have to first reach January 1st of the year after you claim it. Then the very next year is when that 10% kicks in. So you basically have a gap year between purchase and declaring the homestead exemption whenever that 10% limitation on the appraised value kicks in. For example, let's say that on April the 25th, 2022, John Tuttle buys the home of Ben Pierce. And January 1st of 2023, John Tuttle claims the residence homestead tax exemption. So we're talking this coming January. Well, January 1st, 2023 would be the first January 1st that John Tuttle is recorded as having that residence homestead tax exemption on the property. So January 1st, 2024 is when that 10% cap would kick in. Another example, Walter White on May 23rd, 2022 buys a rental house that Marty Bird owned. Well, we know that laws recently changed that allows you to immediately apply for the homestead exemption as soon as you buy the property. So Walter White immediately applied for the residence homestead tax exemption as soon as that house was closed on May 23rd. January 1st, 2023 will be the first January 1st that Walter White's recorded is having the residence homestead tax exemption. So that means January 1, 2024 is when that 10% increase in the appraised value will take effect, when that cap will take effect. So again, even though you could apply immediately, you have to hit that very first January 1st, and then the next year is when the cap kicks in. Here's another example, November the 12th, 2020. We're talking, about a year and a half ago. Troy Landry bought the home of Saul Goodman. Thing is that Troy Landry forgot to go in and apply for the homestead exemption on April the 30th, 2021. He missed the deadline. February 1st, 2022 of this year, Troy said, I'm going to make sure and get it in. I'm not going to miss the deadline. So he goes in and he claims his residence homestead for last year. He says, hey, appraisal district, I missed the deadline. I want to apply for last year. The appraisal district can go in and they can apply that retroactively. So the Central Appraisal District records the residence homestead tax exemption starting on January the 1st, 2021 for Troy. So they've gone back a year. January 1, 2021, then would be the first January 1st that Troy's recorded as having a residence homestead tax exemption on the property. So that means January 1st, 2022, that's whenever that 10% cap kicks in for that appraised value. So again, there's a gap year in here. Now, I will tell you there's bonus points given today if you caught all the pop culture references that I had in my examples. If you didn't catch them, go back and look at the video, see if you can find out all the pop culture references in there. But the rule of thumb here for this residence homestead tax exemption and that 10% cap is take your purchase year. the year that you purchased the property, add 2 to that year. That's the year that the 10% cap will kick in. So for instance, if you bought a home in 2020, you add 2 to that year, the 10% cap kicks in 2022. If you buy it in 2021, you add 2 to that, that means 2023 will be the year that that 10% cap starts. If you buy a home this year in 2022, you add 2 to that, 2024 will be the year that that cap will begin. So very important, again, something that I just found out this week. I know appraisal districts, I know that y'all are getting ready for so many appeals this year. If you're going to appeal, take a look at the year that you purchased your property, and that may answer your question as why the 10% cap has not kicked in if you bought it in 2021 or later. Again, anyone that purchased their home 2021 or later and filed their homestead exemption, this year will be the first January that you're listed as being January 1, you have the homestead exemption. The 10% will kick in January 1 of 2023. Now, we've covered that part for school districts. However, it's also mandatory for the residence homestead. If you have the residence homestead exemption on your home, counties are required to offer a minimum of $3,000 of an exemption if the county collects farm to market road or flood control taxes. So that is mandatory as well. You get another benefit. So for county taxes, you would take your total appraised value and subtract off that $3,000, and then you can multiply it by your tax rate to figure out here's how much, here's what the exemption would do for me. There are some other options, some local option. Any other taxing unit, it does not matter what taxing unit it is. A MUD could offer it. A city could offer another option of a homestead exemption. So any taxing unit can decide to offer a separate residence homestead exemption. Now, if they do that, it has to be either 20% of the property's appraised value, but it cannot be less than $5,000. If you go onto the Central Appraisal District's website, you can get a breakdown of each one of the taxing districts, and you can see what exemptions they offer. There's usually a column for homestead exemption, and it will list each one of those, what they offer. If nothing's listed, then that means that taxing unit is not offering an exemption there. We rarely see exemptions offered for, say, like MUD districts. So this is a pretty important, pretty valuable exemption that we can have out there. So how do you qualify? Well, you have to have ownership interest in the property, and the owner must use the property as your principal residence. There you go. That's what has to, that's how you qualify. And then you fill out the application. I'm going to say you cannot claim homesteads on 2 properties inside or outside of Texas. So if you own a property in Tarrant County, and let's say that you have another home somewhere on a lake, let's say it's up near Whitesboro on the lake, you cannot claim both as your homestead at the same time. It has to be one or the other. The address on your driver's license or state ID, it has to match the address on the property that you're claiming as your homestead. So that's the one that'll really get a lot of people from trying to claim it on 2 different properties at the same time. Now, I can say that this, the address being the same, it can be waived for active duty if you're active duty in the U.S. Armed Services, or you're a spouse of active duty. That can be waived. However, you have to include a copy of your military ID card and a copy of the utility bill is usually what the appraisal districts are going to ask for. So, again, the key here, you cannot have it on two properties at the same time. Address you have to live there, and you have to have ownership interest, and you also, your IDs have to match. Trust can receive the homestead exemption, but the owner has to either be the trustor or the beneficiary of a trust. LLCs, nope, can't do it. Not going to work. LLC cannot qualify for your homestead exemption. You've also got some properties that have dual purposes. That might be a business on the ground floor of a building, and then your homestead is up above, or maybe you have the business, your business in the front of the building, and then your homestead is in the back. I affectionately like to call these mullet properties, business in the front, party in the back. In this case, you can ask the Central Appraisal District to come out, and if it qualified, they will separate that property out by two different ID numbers so that you can claim homestead on the part where you live, and then the business has a separate ID number and it's taxed differently. The age 65 and disabled exemption goes hand in hand with the homestead. It's a very important one as well. For this exemption, it's mandatory that school districts offer an additional $10,000 residence homestead exemption to persons that are age 65 or older, or if they're disabled. They can offer more if they would like, but 10,000 is the minimum. If you happen to qualify for both, in other words, let's say that you're 70 years old and you're disabled, you have to choose one for school district taxes. They both work the same. It does not matter which one you claim. Both of them are going to give you the exact same benefit. Cities, counties, or special use districts such as MUDs, they can offer a separate residence homestead exemption for age 65 or disabled. This exemption, if they choose to do so, cannot be less than $3,000. Now, let's say that you've got, someone that's over 65, they've claimed this over 65 exemption, and they're married to somebody, and the person that's claimed the exemption, they pass away. As long as their spouse is 55 or older, they get to keep that exemption. They get to keep that in place. If a county, city, or junior college district offers that separate tax limitation, again, the surviving spouse that's age 55 or older gets to retain that tax ceiling. So in other words, anybody that's over 55 has a spouse that's already claimed the over 65 exemption, they get to keep that exemption in place. Another huge benefit, probably even bigger than the $10,000 that's taken off the value of the property, is your school taxes get to be frozen whenever you turn 65 and you apply for this over 65 exemption. School districts cannot increase the total amount after you qualify for that exemption. So, your school taxes get to be frozen after that point in time. Now, there's always a but, and there is a but to this one. If you make improvements to your home, let's say that you add a separate room onto the house after you turn 65 and you have those taxes frozen, those school district taxes frozen, the Central Appraisal District can come out, can appraise that addition at market value, raise the appraised value, raise that ceiling on those taxes, and then freeze them at the new level. Okay, so you're not going to get, there's always a small little button here. This is one, if you make improvements, yes, absolutely, your school district taxes can go up by the value of that improvement. Here's another one that I found out whenever my mother moved down here to the Metroplex. She moved in here from West Texas, and she was in a little small town in West Texas where her property taxes were extremely low. And whenever she got ready to build a house and move down here to be closer to family, the property taxes just about choked her down. To put it in perspective, whenever she was living in West Texas, her total tax bill for the entire year was $600 for the entire year. Whenever she was looking at building a house down here just outside of Denton in a retirement community, I estimated, given the current tax rates, her tax bill would go up to about $7,500 a year. So needless to say, my mother was a little bit worried. And then I happened to find out about this, about transferring or porting the percentages. This one is a game changer. This one's worth listening to, even worth going back and listening to again on the video replay. Resident owners of homesteads that are over the age of 65 or that are disabled can take their percentage ceiling with them whenever they move. Okay, you've got your taxes locked in. You've got your school district taxes locked in. They're capped. But the market value continues to increase, and so should the amount that you pay in those taxes if you were paying them at market value. The thing is that you're saving a percentage because your taxes are capped. So you're saving a percentage. Whenever you move, you can take that percentage savings with you. Here's an example. Let's say that for school tax purposes, and I know that these are extremely low, but it makes the math easy. Let's say that your market value school taxes were $400 on your homestead that you're living in right now. That's market value, but you capped them a long time ago. And whenever you capped them, they stopped at $100. You should be paying $400. You're only paying $100 in school taxes. Well, you're paying 25% of what you should be paying. You move to a new property. I mean, you've hit the lottery and you move to your mansion in the hills, and your market value school taxes should be $100,000 a year. But you get to take that 25% with you. That means that after you transfer these percentages, you're going to only pay $25,000. You're going to pay 25% of what you should be paying at market because you transfer that percentage with you. It does not matter if you upsize, it does not matter if you downsize. You can take this percentage with you whenever you move, but you're moving residence homesteads. So how do you do it? Well, first step, go to the central appraisal district where you're moving from and ask for the person that deals with the over 65 exemption. Not everybody in the office will know what you're asking for. So ask for the person that deals with over 65 and tell them that you're moving, you're over 65, and you want to get your certificate of transfer. You want to move your percentages with you. They'll know what you're talking about. They'll give you your certificate. Then you move to your new address and you update your driver's license, because remember, the driver's license has to match. Then you give that certificate to the new central appraisal district. It's that easy. It's that simple to transfer those percentages. The kicker is you have to be moving within Texas, so one Texas residence to another, and you have to apply for it. That's the requirements here. Now, I mentioned my mother earlier. Here is her actual transfer certificate. I blacked out her name and property address to kind of secure some of her anonymity. But this is the actual transfer certificate that she got whenever she moved from West Texas. You'll notice the amount of school taxes, the amount that was transferred. It's the very last line down on the bottom. That indicated how much she was paying in school property taxes in West Texas. She was paying $0 in school taxes in West Texas. Now, why is that the case? Well, whenever she turned 65, the value of her property, the appraised value of her property was $34,600. Well, we know from this class already, she got $25,000 exemption for it being her residence homestead. She got an additional $10,000 for her being over 65. So she had $35,000 in exemptions. Her homestead was worth $34,600. So that means that effectively for school tax purposes, value of her home was $0. She was paying $0 in school taxes in West Texas. She transfers this exemption to Denton County. She's paying $0 in school taxes in Denton County. Now, this is the extreme case. Absolutely it is. But I can tell you, given the way that market values have gone over the last 2 years, there's been people that bought a home, say in 2020 or even 2021, that already had, or maybe they turned 65 in 2020 or 2021, and they've got a significant savings already. They've got a significant percentage already built up. So it's very well worth it to go into to transfer these percentages. Now, I know the question that's running through your mind, maybe I can catch it even before Jacqueline speaks up. How long do I have to do this? There's nothing in the law that says anything about being a time limit. So this may be where the Central Appraisal District may want to chime in a second, but I have seen some individuals that have gone, and they moved a few years ago. They went this year and asked for the transfer certificate, gave it to the new Central Appraisal District, and the appraisal district actually refunded them some money, and they froze it at that new level with the percentages applied. So is the appraisal district, is Tarrant County still on? How do you handle that? How many years do you have?
They are not on at this time.
They're not on at this time. Okay. My suggestion, no matter when you've moved, I do know that the appraisal district can go back and that they can retroactively say, apply your residence homestead for up to 2 years. If you've moved, if you're over 65, I would go get that transfer certificate. I would take it down to the Central Appraisal District. I would tell them, you know what? I didn't do it whenever I moved, but now I just found out about it. I would like to transfer my percentages, and that will help you out with your property taxes tremendously. And like I said, I've even heard of some individuals getting some refund from the tax district. Veterans and first responders. Here's another group that does get a benefit. If you're a veteran and you're disabled, then they're going to look at a sliding scale, and you're going to get so much of an exemption based on your level of disability. So you can see the different levels over here. 10 to 30% gets an additional 5,000 off. 30 to 50 gets 7,500. 50 to 70 gets 10,000 off. 70 and over gets 12. And yes, if you're 100% disabled, then you are completely exempt from those property taxes. Not from all taxes, though. Some districts, such as MUDs, you're not going to be exempt from those. But from your county, your city, school district, things like that, yes, absolutely, you can be 100% exempt from. Again, totally disabled, yes, you can get 100% disability if that was due to a service-connected disability. if you are the surviving spouse of a U.S. Armed Service member killed in action, you can also get this exemption. Kicker here, you cannot have remarried. The property has to be the residence homestead of the surviving spouse whenever the veteran died. And also property also remains in the residence homestead of the surviving spouse. But you can get that property tax exemption. It can carry over to a surviving spouse. If the surviving spouse happens to move, then they're entitled to the same dollar amount, not percentage, same dollar amount as the former exemption. So in this case, if you wanted to keep your property taxes the same, then you would move to a property that was of equal value or less. You do lose it if you remarry here in the chief appraiser or in the county of the former residence where the homestead was located. If you're moving, they're the ones that provide that written certificate, and you take it to the new central appraisal district. Surviving spouses of first responders, they also are provided with a benefit. They get a total property tax exemption from the residence homestead. To qualify here, the first responder was killed in the line of duty and the spouse has not remarried. If the surviving spouse moves here, again, they're entitled to the same dollar amount as the former exemption. And again, the chief appraiser will give a certificate that they can take to the new appraisal district to get that moved over. Now, we are Texas AgriLife, so we do have to incorporate agriculture in here. So what about combining your homestead and that ag exemption that the central appraisal district just went over? You know, a lot of people have a dream moving out in the country. The state law says that you can claim up to 20 acres as your residence homestead. But as an economist, I would say, why would you ever want to do that unless you just want a big yard to mow? My suggestion is combining homestead and your ag exemption. Here I have an example. I've taken an actual property that was in Collin County at 7.5 acres. This property has water, has electric on it, and it's qualified for the open space. In other words, it is ag exempt currently. Two different scenarios. You buy this property, 7.5 acres. You build a $450,000 house on it, okay? One of them, you declare every bit of it as your homestead. The other one, you declare only 1 acre as your homestead and 6.5 acres you leave in ag. So we've got the same $450,000 house on it. The only difference that we have here, 1 acre homestead, all of the rest of it ag versus every bit of it being homestead. What would that do to your property taxes? That was the simple question that I wanted to answer. Give you a little bit of information here. The market value is $75,000. In other words, it's $10,000 an acre. That was the actual appraised value. The ag value was $803 for that 7.5 acres. In other words, it's $107.70 per acre ag value. And here are the tax rates. And I've given you the exemptions over here. $25,000 for the school, 1% or $5,000 minimum for the Collin County Junior College, for the Collin College, $5,000 minimum or 5% for the county. Those are the rates that we're working with. Now, all you have to do is just use those rates and multiply them by the values. Scenario one, every bit of it being a homestead. In other words, 7.5 acres is a homestead, $450,000 house on that property. You're going to be paying an estimated $8,902.64 in property taxes in 2021. Scenario two, 1 acre homestead, 6.5 acres in ag, you'll pay $7,765.36. So that means just leaving 6.5 acres in ag would have saved you $1,137.28 for 2021 alone. Now, I can tell you that this over time, that difference continues to widen because the market value continues to increase generally over time, whereas the ag value stays roughly the same. So that difference, it widens as we go out in time. Moral of the story here, the law does allow you to claim 20 acres for your homestead. However, a mixture of ag use and homestead produces lower property tax liabilities. So in other words, keep your homestead small as the appraisal district will allow. Generally, they're going to take out 1 acre for your homestead. Leave the rest of the acreage in agriculture because the ag value is so much lower. That ag exemption, it puts the value for property tax purposes so much lower than market value. So a mixture does help. Let's say another situation. You want to purchase some small tract of land, build a $450,000 house on it. You identified a 5-acre tract that already has the ag exemption. Thing is, if you build a house on that, you're going to probably lose the ag exemption because it's going to be underneath that 5-acre minimum. Remember, they're going to take an acre out for the homestead. You'll be left with 4 acres for ag. So you'll probably lose that ag exemption. My question is instead of that 5-acre tract, what if you bumped it up and you bought that 7.5 acres instead? You build the exact same house on the 5-acre is on the 7.5 acre tract. What would be the difference? Well, we can calculate using those same tax rates and all, we can calculate the property tax liability. The property tax on that 5 acres, $8,460. For that 1 acre of your homestead and 6.5 acres in ag, it's $7,765. That's a difference of $695.20 that it would be better to buy the larger piece of land and put a house on 1 acre and leave the rest in ag. And again, this $695, that's in tax year number 1 after you own the property. After that, then the property just continues to, that difference just continues to grow because market values keep growing. So even going a little bit smaller, if you can afford 5, my question is, can you afford 6 or 7? If you can afford anything 6 or over, you can leave 5 acres for bees because that's the minimum that counties will allow is 5 acres. So go a little bit bigger. My next question is how small do we have to go? How small do we have to go so that our property taxes are identical for owning 7.5 acres with 1 acre being our homestead and 6.5 in ag? How small do we have to go so the property taxes there are going to be equal? The answer is 1.07 acres. You build the exact same house on both properties. You'd have to buy 1.07 acres, given the tax rates and that current market value. You'd have to go extremely small in order for your property taxes to be identical. So again, if you're looking at getting a little bit of acreage, my question is can you afford to go something like 6 or above in terms of acreage? Otherwise, you're just looking at a really big yard that you're going to have to take care of. And yeah, you may get a garden, but you could also get that with ag property. Moral of the story here, go big, at least 6 acres, because remember, they're going to take an acre out for your homestead. Suggestion here, combining homestead and the ag exemption results in lower property taxes. Homesteading it all versus homestead and ag, well, you're going to be paying higher property taxes, if you homestead every bit of it. I would not recommend homesteading 20 acres if you owned 20 acres of ag property, unless your house took up every bit of that 20 acres. I wouldn't do it. Filing for the homestead exemption, same rule applies here. It's due this afternoon if you're going to get it for 2022. So, you know, that one, you need to be working on it and have it filed. You can download right here. You can download the form from the Texas Comptroller. Yes, there are services out there that will send you letters after you've moved. Hey, we'll file your homestead exemption for you for a fee of 60, 65, 70 bucks. Don't do that. Don't do that. That form is easy enough to fill out. You can do it for free. Then you drop it off at the Central Appraisal District. Again, filing deadline, you got to have it in before May the 1st. So get that thing in. There are some late provisions for disabled veterans or the surviving spouse of persons killed in the armed forces or surviving spouse of the first responder. If you don't qualify for that, make sure that you get it in. They can accept up to 2 years of delinquency. So, you know, they can go back up to 2 years if you miss the deadline. You can go in and retroactively file it and they'll put it on retroactively. But again, make sure that you get that on, because not only do you get the lower property taxes, but also it's very, very quick at when you get that 10% cap in. Here's a copy of the form, pretty simple. I've shown you a copy here, going through some of it. Don't forget to fill out this part at the top. It's asking you, do you own the property? If you don't own the property, in other words, if you rent it, I'm sorry, you can't fill it out. You can't get the homestead exemption on it. Second part is where you claim your exemptions. You know, your homestead, disabled persons over 65. You may be asked to show some additional documentation to make sure, yes, you are over 65. In other words, you're going to get carded whenever you're 65 years or older. You may be asked to provide some sort of forms as far as showing your disability. Next part, that's the property owner and the property information. You need to make sure and fill that out. Pretty simple. It's address like that, date you acquired the property. Whenever it asks you what second page here, manufactured home or not, don't fill this out if it's not a manufactured home. Don't fill that part out if it's not. Second part, waiver of required documentation. This is saying you're a resident of a facility that provides services related to health, infirmary, or aging, you know, things like that. Questions there. At another residential property in the state of Texas, if you say yes and you provide an address there, you got to pick one. You can only have residence homestead on one property. Don't forget to sign it, date it, and attach any required documents. And do not send this to Austin. You take it to your local Central Appraisal District. Some problems that can occur with these appraisals. Let's say you live in Houston, Texas. You got a homestead exemption on your property. You hit the lottery. I mean, Powerball came in. Oh my gosh, you know, I've hit it big. You build a home in Conroe, right outside of Houston. You move in, declare your homestead, and you move into your new mansion. Thing is, you keep your homestead, you keep your old house in Houston, you rent that thing out. That's going to fund your children's new monthly clothing allowance. So in other words, we've just built our mansion, we moved in, and we're just going to rent out the old house. You know, all the jet setting, you forgot to take the homestead off that old rental house that you owned. Because now you're under two different Central Appraisal Districts. You're in two counties. The first one, the old house, they may not catch it for a while. You know, they may not catch it that you still have the residence homestead on this house, but you're renting it out. You've moved homesteads. Eventually, they're going to catch it. And you're going to be charged the difference between what you should have paid and what you did pay plus interest. So if you move and you choose to keep the old home and rent it out, make sure you remove your homestead from the first property. This one, probably the most common that I've seen and that I've heard about. Finally, why are exemptions denied? Well, for any number of reasons. You're not entitled to the exemption. If you're 50 years old, you cannot apply for the over 65 exemption. I'm sorry, you don't qualify yet. The property doesn't qualify. You know, you don't have a house on the property. You cannot declare it as your residence homestead. Documentation filed with the application doesn't support the exemption. Applications not filed timely. You don't get the thing in by this afternoon, then you're not going to get the exemption this year. In the case of over 65 or disabled, only one exemption can be claimed. So if you try and claim both over 65 and disabled, you're not going to get both. The documentation filed for the homestead exemption does not match the property address. In other words, if I tried to file a homestead exemption and I provide documentation for Jacqueline's house, it wouldn't work. It wouldn't work. The documentation I provide is for a house in Collin County. Jacqueline owns the house over in Tarrant County. Not going to happen. In case of residents, an exemption's already been granted on another property. In other words, we've already got this residence homestead on another house in Tarrant County. You have to remove one before you can get the other. I'd be happy to open it up to any type of questions that you may have, anything at all.
Blake, Blake,
Yes.
there's one in the chat. Can we move from a homesteaded house to a new building without a gap in the homestead on the new house?
Without a gap.
Yes.
Absolutely, you can. As soon as you move, you can declare that homestead exemption. A new law was passed in the last year that allows you to immediately claim that homestead on the new property. The only time that you would really be doing this is if you have, say, you're moving into a house that someone had as a rental. If it's a new build, I would not suggest that you do this. The reason is the new build, January 1st, the appraisal district's going to value that property probably as, let's say, an unimproved lot. So the appraised value is going to be extremely low. They cannot appraise a property as a homestead with improvements until it is livable. Case in point, my mother moved down here. She closed on her house in February of 2020. Well, January 1 of 2020, her house, her lot was valued as an unimproved lot. It was valued at $60,000. The day that she moved in and closed, she bought the house. It was $249,000. My mother, yes, she could have claimed the homestead immediately, and they would have adjusted that property's value up from the $60,000 to the $240,000. But no, don't do that. She needed to wait, and she did wait until January 1 of 2021. Then she claimed the homestead exemption. Now, let's say that Jacqueline owns a rental house in Fort Worth. And that rental house, let's say it's $100,000, and she sells that rental house to me. I can immediately today, as soon as we close, I can go into the Central Appraisal District and I can claim that residence homestead on that house today. And they will prorate out those property taxes for the year based on me having that residence homestead in place. So it will benefit me there to claim it immediately. It was a long answer to a very short question. I'm sorry. I hope that that explained it fully though. Anything else? All right, well, if nothing else, if you haven't got your residence homestead exemption on file, get it in by April 30th, get it in by the end of the day. Very, very important. If you happen to miss it, yes, you can go back and you can retroactively apply. Talk to your central appraisal district about doing that. But make sure you get your residence homestead on your house that you own and that you're living in, because it does help you quite a bit in several ways.
Awesome. Thank you, Blake. Are there any other questions at this time from anyone? If not, if everybody that is still on the call, I just posted in the chat a link to a quick survey. Being that Blake and I are part of the AgriLife extension aspects, part of our job is to ask everyone to complete a survey for us. This helps us in terms of being able to bring quality programs to the public. So it'd be a great help if y'all would just click on that and fill a few things out for us. We would appreciate it. Again, this meeting has been recorded today. If you will give me a couple of days, once I have everything uploaded and a few things edited, I will be posting it to the Tarrant AgriLife Extension's YouTube page. Once it is posted there, I will send the link out to everyone for a refresher. Just as a reminder, anyone that has a real estate license, in order to receive your credit hour for today, you would have had to have been live on the program today. So thank you, Brandy, for posting that in the chat. Blake, I will get you a list of all of the real estate license numbers. That way you could turn that in for us today.
Sounds absolutely great. Yes, I will get that turned in and you'll have credit just immediately as soon as I get those numbers.
Perfect. So if there are not any other questions, we will go ahead and call it a day and let y'all enjoy the rest of your Friday as well as your weekend. Blake, again, thank you. As always, great having meetings with you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for having me on.
So, and if anybody needs anything from either myself or Blake or any questions at any time, you can always find us at your local extension office. So y'all have a great day.